And Your Honor, the state's certainly entitled to make their argument as they wish, but the defense will not have any argument today.
Your Honor, this is a preliminary hearing. Is there probable cause that a felony was committed and that this defendant committed that felony? Not guilty on a reasonable doubt. Count 1 is first-degree murder, a felony murder. That is UJI 14-202. Your Honor, would you like a copy of the notes I'm reading off of that have all the UJIs? Okay.
Get there?
Certainly.
14-202?
14-202 for felony murder, Your Honor. The elements are, excuse me?
Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. The elements are that the defendant committed the crime of aggravated fleeing a law enforcement officer under circumstances or in a manner dangerous to human life. 2, that the defendant caused the death. For count 1, it's Frank Lovato. For count 2, it is Robert Duran. During the commission of or attempt to commit aggravated fleeing a law enforcement officer. 3, the defendant intended to kill or knew that her acts created a strong probability of death or great bodily harm. And 4, which I don't think is relevant here, the defendant did not act as a result of sufficient provocation. And 5, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 2nd day of March 2022. The testimony from all the witnesses, this was clearly in Santa Fe County, state of New Mexico on March 2nd, 2022. The chase began around 11 o'clock in the morning and continued for, as we saw from the lapel video, the dash camera video from Officer Romero for about 12 minutes. The defendant was clearly committing aggravated fleeing. We do have to provide the elements for aggravated fleeing.
What is, in element 1, what do you the crime of?
The crime of aggravated fleeing a law enforcement officer.
And then it says cause the death of during the commission of the aggravated fleeing. Okay.
Yes, Your Honor. And the aggravated fleeing, we would get into those elements because that's also a separate charge itself, but that's UJI 14-2217. So we have to prove aggravated fleeing, and then we have to prove the elements of felony murder in the commission of those elements of aggravated fleeing. And so aggravated fleeing is that the defendant operated a motor vehicle, the defendant drove willfully and carelessly in a manner that endangered the life of another person, the defendant had been given a visual or audible signal to stop by a uniformed law enforcement officer in an appropriately marked law enforcement vehicle. The defendant knew that a law enforcement officer had given her an audible or visual signal to stop. And again, this happened in New Mexico on or about the 2nd day of March 2022. So the defendant was operating a motor vehicle. We have the testimony of that. We have the testimony from Officer Romero, who said that when he first initially tried to stop that white Chevy Malibu, he saw one person in the driver's seat and didn't see anybody else. We have the testimony from Officer Romero and Officer Norris that when the white Chevy Malibu stopped, the defendant was the only one that got out, and they had eyes on that vehicle the entire time. Nobody else got on the vehicle. Nobody else was inside the vehicle. We have the testimony from Agent Harwell that the dash data recorder of the white Chevy Malibu showed that at the time of the crash that there was no weight in the passenger seat. That's why the passenger airbag didn't deploy. That the driver's airbag did deploy. We have the testimony of Ms. Birdsong that she tested the DNA found on that driver's airbag, and the major DNA profile was the defendant. The defendant also, when she was put in the back of Officer Norris's vehicle, that she had keys with her. She was the one operating that motor vehicle. There was nobody else. She talked about how there was some other mark involved, but we heard the testimony of Jerry Chavez that it was actually him who was in the car at first when it was at the Vizcaya apartments, that he was, they had slept in that car that night. That morning they got into an argument. He got out so she could cool off. When he got back in, she was in the driver's seat. He was in the passenger seat. That they continued to argue. She called out to a passerby and said, "Help, help." And then that passerby said, "I'm calling the police." and Jerry Chavez decided this isn't worth it, I gotta get out of there. Gets out of the car and doesn't run because he can't run, he walks. He walks with his braced up knees and his walking sticks down to what he described as a tunnel. We heard the testimony of Agent Harwell, who said that he watched security camera footage from both the Vizcaya apartments and the Santa Fe suites nearby, showing, he described it as far away, not very clear, but it described showing somebody get out and walk into that area, consistent with what Jerry Chavez described happening. Nobody else ever got into that vehicle other than the defendant. Nobody else ever got out of that vehicle. It all shows that it was the defendant operating that motor vehicle. She was operating that motor vehicle, and she drove willfully and carelessly in a manner that endangered the life of another person. We saw the 12 minutes of dash camera video from Officer Romero. It is clear she is weaving in and out of traffic. She is speeding 45 miles per hour over speed bumps in what appears to be a residential area on that dash camera video. She's going the wrong way multiple times. Officers described her going the wrong way on St. Michael's and then going the wrong way on I-25 twice. First, she's heading northbound in the southbound lanes, and then she's heading southbound in the northbound lanes. She was clearly operating the motor vehicle and driving willfully and carelessly in a manner that endangered the life of another person. She had been given a visual or audible signal to stop by a uniformed law enforcement officer in an appropriate marked law enforcement vehicle. We heard the testimony from both Officer Romero and Officer Norris. They were both in their full uniforms. They were both in fully marked units. We could actually see the other units in the dash camera video from Officer Romero, that they were uniformed, they were in appropriately marked vehicles, and both lights and sirens were going during that entire almost 12-minute chase. We did hear testimony from other witnesses that didn't hear sirens, but we actually could hear them in the dash camera video that was played for the court. And the defendant knew that a law enforcement officer had given her an audible or visual signal. That's why she's weaving in and out of traffic. She had just had somebody call the police, and then within seconds, right at that intersection, which is right in front of the Vizcaya apartments, she's got a police officer behind her, and she starts to get into the left turn lane, swings over into straight lane on St. Francis, and then starts speeding around with 4 police officers with lights and sirens behind her. So she clearly knew officers had given her a signal, and if she didn't see them behind her, she turned around multiple times and saw them behind her. So she was committing aggravated fleeing. So we're actually still buried in count 1, UJI 14-202 with a felony murder. She was committing aggravated fleeing a law enforcement officer.
All right, you do not wish to respond, is that correct, Mr. Hughes?
That's correct, Your Honor. Thank you.
So with respect to count 1, first degree murder via felony murder, and count 2, first degree murder via felony murder, the court does find probable cause with respect to the first degree murder of Frank Mulatto, felony murder, and the first degree felony murder of Robert Duran. I'm not going to certainly go through those things listed, the evidence that the state recited, but it does meet the elements. The defendant, Jeannine Jaramillo, did commit the crime of aggravated fleeing a law enforcement officer. She does meet those elements of operating a motor vehicle willfully and carelessly in a manner that endangered the life of another person, and that she had been given a visual or audible signal to stop by a uniformed law enforcement officer in an appropriately marked law enforcement vehicle, and that she knew that she'd been given that signal. And the felony that she committed of aggravated fleeing of a law enforcement officer, forced by the findings of the evidence, caused the death of Frank Mulatto for count 1 and Robert Duran for count 2. Knowing the defendant intended to kill her, knew that her acts created a strong probability of death that law would not count as the men. Next.
Mr. Your Honor, we also are presenting in the alternatives first degree depraved mind murder. Depraved mind murder, that is UGI 14-203.
That is that the defendant drove for miles at speeds of over 90 miles an hour on the wrong way on I-25, that she was driving very recklessly, that the defendant's act caused the death of Frank Lovato and Robert Duran, that the act of the defendant was greatly dangerous to the lives of others, indicating a depraved mind without regard for human life. The defendant knew that the act was greatly dangerous to the lives of others. This happened in New Mexico on or about March 2nd, 2022. That UJI also describes in more detail a depraved mind. It says a person acts with a depraved mind by intentionally engaging in outrageously reckless conduct with a depraved kind of wantonness or total indifference for the value of human life. Mere negligence or recklessness is not enough. In addition, the defendant must have a corrupt, perverted, or malicious state of mind, such as when a person acts with ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. Whether a person acted with a depraved mind may be inferred from all the facts and circumstances of the case. And Your Honor, her total indifference to the value of human life was actually testified to by some of the witnesses. We heard the officers talk about how as she was going the wrong way on I-25, she almost hit other cars, continued on before actually causing the wreck, that officers couldn't keep up. I'm sorry, I thought I wrote down, I believe it was Officer Montano who said that the person was driving the vehicle as if they didn't care about anyone. That was his actual testimony. They looked like they didn't care about anybody. And when you watch that video from Officer Romero's dash camera video, she does not care about anybody that she's putting in danger. She's going 45 miles an hour through a residential area over several speed bumps. You can see the speed bumps going. The officers are going over 80 miles an hour trying to catch up to her and can't. She is and it's not just a few minutes either. This is almost 12 minutes of heavy traffic. I know officers who have to deal with patrol all the time are talking about, well, it was light, it was moderate. We can see on that video from St. Francis to St. Michael's, that's heavy traffic, weaving all over the road, cutting cars off. The only time where traffic isn't heavy is when they get off onto that old Chamisa Road and Chamisa Road, which looks residential as you watch that video that has the speed bumps, and still she's putting everybody in danger as if she didn't care. Totally wantonly reckless, as the UJI describes. And then she comes back onto St. Michael's Road, still heavy traffic. And then goes into what I would consider heavy traffic onto I-25 northbound. Around all those cars, a U-turn, going in, almost hitting other cars. No, Your Honor, I would like to cite a case even. In State v. Dowling, 2001, but I thought it cited into it. Oh, okay. In State v. Omar Muhammad, the defendant was eluding law enforcement by knowingly trying to run them off the road and knowingly driving at a high rate of speed through roadblocks and driving in an extremely reckless manner. The facts we have here are very, very similar, and I would submit, from what I understand of the Omar Muhammad case, it actually went on for a longer period of time in this case. Again, nearly 12 minutes on that video. When you watch that video is a lot of the evidence of the depraved mind, of the total indifference to the value of human life. She's malicious. That's also why we presented evidence regarding what she has done before. The court listened to evidence of the September 7th, 2021 incident in Seagull County, which was eerily similar. Luckily, nobody was hurt in that instance. But she again led deputies on a chase, crashing through fences, and then trying to lie about it. She knows she's a danger, and then she still does it again. And so that is the level heightened knowledge and heightened indifference and wantonness, maliciousness even, of the defendant as she was leading 4 police officers in that 12-minute chase, Your Honor. And so that is the state's argument regarding probable cause for the alternative first-degree depraved mind murder.
All right, thank you. Mr. Key, do you wish me to ask you each time, or do you wish to just, I know you made a statement, so shall I just consider that a blanket statement?
Yes, Your Honor, thank you.
Thank you. All right, with respect to the alternative first-degree murder depraved mind, the court finds that the state has met its burden of preponderance of the evidence, both in count 1 and count 2. Count 1 regarding Frank Lovato and count 2 regarding Robert Durant. We spent the afternoon viewing videos of complete, very reckless driving, long time reckless driving through various areas, only to end up on the wrong side, on both sides of I-25. Her acts caused the death of these gentlemen. The act of the defendant was greatly dangerous to the lives of others, indicating a depraved mind without regard for human life, and that the defendant knew that her act was greatly dangerous. She does meet the portion that says a person acts with a depraved mind by intentionally engaging. Certainly, evidence demonstrated intentional engaging in outrageously reckless conduct with a depraved kind of wantonness or total indifference for the value of human life. I think we can see that on the video. Mere negligence or recklessness is not enough. In addition, the defendant must have a corrupt, perverted, or malicious state of mind, such as when a person acts with ill will, hatred, spite, or evil intent. I think that the locations, the length, and the manner, the length to which she went, I think that shows the ill will, evil intent. So that's found over.